Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this one-hour broadcast is World Watchers. It is program number 822, September the 5th, 1987. For the past few months, or for the past month, I've been announcing that at the end of September, in 2 more weeks, I'm going to continue World Watchers on KAZU. It emanates from Pacific Grove, California. I'll have 1 hour of news, just like I do each week, and 1 hour and then an hour following of talk show. But I'm going to limit the cassettes that go out to the public or that are played on other radio stations, because I want to cut down on the amount of mail and telephone calls and correspondence with so many different people that I want to use that time to better advantage to start writing. So instead of reaching such a large audience by radio, I'm going to divert my attention to articles and books, hopefully, and put some of this material now. It's time to put it down in writing. I did say last week that I would talk about John Singlov and the role of the CIA and private institutions destabilizing the Philippines, but I've decided that there's something more important that I want to put on the air for this hour and exclude all the other pieces of news. It was hard to make the decision, but I know I'm making the right one, and I want to share some material with you that maybe will take 1 week or even 2 weeks. There are many articles and witnesses now testifying about the narcotics connections to South America, the cocaine connections, and the links of weapons brought in or sent down there in exchange for narcotics and cocaine coming to the United States. And one of the reasons that people on the Iran Contra committee and the attorneys and the staffs are staying so far away from the narcotics story isn't just that cocaine is coming in through Colombia, through the Medellin cartel, and is being used to help fight the freedom fighters, as the president and others call them, the people opposing the government in Nicaragua. But the big story behind all of this is the international link of the Medellin cartel and its close affinity to the Klaus Barbie connections in Bolivia, to the cocaine connections in Bolivia, to the Joseph Mengele connections in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and to Syria and Palermo, Italy, and then back into the banks of E.F. Hutton and into the bank of the stockbroker firm of Merrill Lynch, and also the Swiss accounts represented by Willard Zucker, the banker in Switzerland who's been there since he started working for Bernie Kornfeld and Robert Vesco. The big story that the powers that be don't want to get out is the total global picture. Therefore, they can't start with the little one, because the other one would connect too big, and it does connect to the Defense Intelligence Agency, to the CIA, to the Secret Service, the customs officials, and the cabinet members of the Reagan administration and those before him. Now, last week, I was talking about an important article that referred to a company in Poland where weapons were bought, where a ship picked up weapons to send to the Contras. But in terms of that article, the important part was that Oliver North and General John Secord were buying arms from what was described as Syria's largest drug and arms family. That's Manzar al-Kassar, and I did quite a bit on him last week. And I said that if this was Syria's largest drug and arms family, Manzar al-Kassar, with his links to Abu Abbas, the mastermind of the Kili Lora, and so forth, then these were the links to Syria of Henri Arsan, the man whose deposit of narcotics money was going to the United States, funds into Merrill Lynch and also to the Swiss banks. And then it had to link to Stibaum, the organization of Arsan, and make that circle of Sao Paulo with Joseph Mengele and Barbie, lining them up again with Edwin Wilson and Theodore Shackley and Licio Gelli and Michael Ledeen, names that you've heard me mention before. But with this article that came out just a while back, actually it was in April, in Newsday, titled Syrian Drug Dealer Linked to Oliver North's Arms Network and Helped Supply the Contra Arms, I knew that the connections to the Middle East, to the drug enforcement agent that went over there with the ship, the work of Ollie North and Secord in this area, working with and buying weapons from Syria's largest drug dealer, who has his home base in Vienna, in Austria, that this eventually would make the connections that were very important the drug enforcement agent who got $200,000 plus much more. The excuse was to get the hostages, but the real story is the narcotics in that area, and then from there sending arms to Iran and sending the drugs to this country. But I knew those connections would be coming in very shortly, but I didn't dream they'd be coming in so quickly. And sure enough, just this week there was an article out of New Times published in the Soviet Union making very clear, or clear enough, the connections that I've been waiting for, and making the Italian connections to the Iran-Contra affair that are the least described, because when the story of sending arms to Iran first broke, there was the subject of Italian ships sending arms to Iran from the United States, and then that was hushed up very quickly. Now, taking a very conservative magazine like Reader's Digest, in November 1983, they had an article called Drugs for Guns. And just quoting a little bit of this article, it said, for years, international law enforcement tried to solve the riddle, how hundreds of millions of dollars generated by Middle East drug traffic were being absorbed, and by whom. By January 1981, confirmation began emerging. Within 3 years, in the Italian city of Trento, authorities indicted more than 200 heroin smugglers. Now, these dates are very important. In January 81 is when Ronald Reagan was inaugurated, and what he was going to do was to continue the path of the team before him, particularly Richard Nixon, who was very much part of this operation. Once John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy were killed and out of the way, and Richard Nixon was in, these operations escalated, and the date of Reagan's inauguration in this time period is important. The article said by January 81, as I said, the confirmation began emerging within 3 years in the Italian city of Trento, that's 81 to 84, where authorities indicted more than 200 heroin smugglers, brokers, financiers in a conspiracy linking them to the purchase of enough arms and ammunition to equip armies. In 1981 alone, Italian magistrate Carlo Palermo, who was prosecuting the case, said they smuggled more than 4,000 kilos of high-grade heroin and morphine base. By far the largest portion of morphine was sold to mafia operators and labs in Sicily and northern Italy. They would refine it into heroin, send it to the mob importers to the United States. This is where the money was being deposited in Merrill Lynch and E.F. Hutton, among other places. The staggering amount was $250 million just for a short time period to the United States, and it represented a potential of $1 billion that they were talking about that time. Once again, the evidence in this case, and the article continues, goes to a drug smuggler named Bekir Celenk, C-E-L-E-N-K. And below they say Mr. Mehmet Ali Agca, the man charged with shooting the Pope, trying to kill him, just months after Ronald Reagan was shot. Reagan was shot in March, and the Pope was shot in May. Agca named Celenk as the man who offered him over $1 million to kill John Paul II. And after his exposure, Celenk was murdered, and I'll do more about that later. In Turkey, they extradited him to Turkey, where he was killed. The orchestrator of the scheme was Henri Arsan, and I bring this up now because of the links that have come out between the Iran-Contra White House Defense Department and Henri Arsan, which is very important to put these pieces together. The article said Henri Arsan was a Syrian who in the late 1960s was a key morphine supplier for the former French connection. In April 1973, Arsan attempted to sell 200 kilos of morphine base to a U.S. undercover agent. He was caught red-handed, but instead of putting him in prison in 1973, that's when, just at the time of the Watergate scandals, when Nixon was just ready to leave office, he agreed to work as an informant for both the United States and the Italian government. He managed to cover his continuing trafficking in arms and drugs, and in the meantime, he turned in his competitors. This is why the big drug arrest if you get your competitor. One vital piece of information he withheld from the American Italian agents was that he was a long-standing customer of a company called Kintex, and of course many of the rifles that were bought in the eastern part of the country of the world, from the Bulgarians and from Russia, and the whole story of arms for Central America and for the Contras has been buying Russian weapons, or a ship that leaves Poland, leaves the Polish harbor, and so forth. And then this article continues. By 1981, operating behind a Milan front company called Stebam, and I've done many years of broadcasts on this, as have David Emery and Nip Tuck. Stebam International's transport, Arsan was no longer equipping terrorists. He was arming entire nations. In October of that year of 81, he invested $8 million on behalf of a one mafia drug ring for the purchase of 20 American-made M48 battle tanks from Spain, and it showed his influence with NATO and with Turkey. In fact, the real buyer for these weapons, starting in 1981, was the country of Iran. And Henri Arsan was working for the Central Intelligence Agency and the Drug Enforcement Agency, or the Secret Services of the United States, and for the Italian government, which was set up with a large network of people heavily involved in these operations. And the country where the weapons were going was the country of Iran. And that was published in 1983, and so far there's been very little mention of those drug connections. Now, another article just came out in April 1987 that regarding a secret bank account that Ollie North and General Secord used, and it had to do with an Operation Yellow Fruit. You've read some of it, and I want to go into it more and tie these pieces together, putting Henri Arsan and Stebam sending weapons to Iran starting in 1981, being a representative of the American intelligence, Henri Arsan, and Italy, a close ally of the United States. This is one of the articles from the LA Times describing a code name Yellow Fruit that ties in through other articles that I want to share with you. The lead story is unauthorized Swiss account. Shadowy Army unit tied to funds aiding the Contras. And the point about this article I'm going to share you is the secret bank accounts, but these bank accounts have to do with the Middle East and with Iran, and they only came out because of the Contra story. This is from the LA Times. A shadowy and scandal-plagued Army intelligence unit, codenamed Yellow Fruit, secretly opened a numbered Swiss account that may have been used as a conduit of funds to aid the Nicaraguan rebels. The officials said the bank account at Credit Suisse, and Credit Suisse was taken over a merger of the Boston Bank with Merrill Lynch, that controlled Credit Suisse in Geneva, was unauthorized by the Defense Department and the Army Command, which did not even know that it existed until last month, March of 1987. CBS News supplied the information to the Pentagon with the account number. CBS, the diligent investigators back there, haven't never been able to find this account. People who were in any position of responsibility or authority knew nothing about this at all. CBS reported money that $75,000 from the account was used by Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North and an associate, Major General Richard Secord, to charter that Danish freighter to deliver a load of Soviet bloc rifles and other weapons to the Contras in the spring of 85. And last week I was talking about that freighter, the Iria, and the money came from a secret account that the Pentagon didn't even know about, and they were buying Soviet bloc rifles to give to the Contras, but the account was set up originally for something different. The network said the money was part of a $2.5 million that was withdrawn from this special account. The Pentagon official, who asked not to be identified by name, declined to say how much money had passed through the account or say whether the funds originated with the Army unit or whether they came from some other source. And the other source, of course, is drugs, and how much could be hundreds and hundreds of millions, as I'll cite later. 1,000 million, I think, was the figure. The official of the Defense Department had information that would lead us to suspect this account, this secret account, was used by North, formerly with the National Security Council, who was instrumental in the sale of arms to Iran, and he wasn't instrumental. This had been going on since the 1980s, since late 79, and General Secord, who became an arms merchant after his retirement from the Air Force. The official said the bank account had been frozen so that funds no longer can be withdrawn. Nevertheless, the account apparently survived more than 3 years after the demise of the Army unit that opened it. it not only survived more than 3 years, but it's been going on a long time. The official said the Iran-Contra investigator Lawrence Walsh has taken over the investigation of this bank account. Now let's see if he does anything with the bank account of Credit Suisse with yellow fruit. I doubt it. He said from the Pentagon that in order to avoid inadvertent interference with Walsh's inquiry, the Army decided not to conduct an investigation of its own. They didn't know when it was opened. They didn't know who used it. They didn't know how much was in it, and we don't want to investigate it. They said it will be done better if it is handled by one agency. The Yellow Fruit Unit was established in the fall of 1982 as part of a super-secret effort to improve the Army's ability to deal with situations such as Iran's seizure of the embassy in Tehran in 1979, November the 4th. Now, if Yellow Fruit was established for that purpose, that would be a legitimate reason for having that money, or to make an operation whether you have to move swiftly. The very fact that the Pentagon didn't know about this doesn't explain a defensive operation where you want to protect American citizens, and therefore you have to have an extra bank account to do it. The article says the organization was racked by charges of impropriety from the first, when it was abolished in December of 83, but as you see, that's a figure of speech because it wasn't abolished at all. 3 of Yellow Fruit's top officials were convicted by court-martials of misconduct involved in the handling of funds. In addition, the commanding officer, Lieutenant Dale Duncan, was convicted in a civilian court of fraudulently claiming expense money, but his conviction was later overturned by the Court of Appeals. You bet it would be. The Pentagon official said that the Army, the FBI, federal prosecutors, and other organizations investigated the unit before and after it was abolished, but none of these inquiries discovered the Swiss bank account. However, CBS informed the Pentagon of the account number. I mentioned that before. Armed with that additional information, the Defense Department was able to verify its existence. If you give us the account number and tell us who was there, and Secord and North used it, then we'll tell you it exists. The official said the Pentagon does not know how many individuals were authorized to draw funds from the account. Of course they wouldn't. They didn't even know where it was. But William T. Golden, a retired Army warrant officer, now employed as a civilian in the Army Department at Fort Huachuca, can't pronounce it right, Huachu, Arizona, was one of the account signatories. Golden was assigned to Yellow Fruit Unit on active duty. He was the chief accuser of Duncan and other officers in the unit. The Pentagon official said he did not know why Golden didn't report the bank account earlier. They accuse these people of mishandling funds, but they don't know where the bank is, and they don't know about the bank number. It said he may have put his name on the signature card without knowing what he had done. The Yellow Fruit Unit was headquartered in suburban Annandale, Virginia. It established a cover organization called Business Security International. BSI was their cover, and many of you have heard of that. And it apparently remained in existence as a corporate shell. The Army unit was disbanded, but these people kept it for what purposes? And Yellow Fruit was active enough into the Iran-Contra scandal to identify it as a source of money deposits. They don't know how much, they didn't know the number, but the cover was in Virginia, and people like Secord and Oliver North, who were going to travel as a DEA agent and buy arms from Syria's largest narcotics peddler and arms dealer. You can wonder what Yellow Fruit was used for and how long. Now, another article that seems separate but isn't separate at all, they all tie together, came from the Houston Post. This is August the 31st, 1983, just last week. Now, several months ago, Program 803, in April, I talked about a firm called Peregrine that was set up by our Defense Department. Some of you might have heard it, some of you may not have heard it. Peregrine described themselves as a group put together in 1981 as, quote, hired guns who had no qualms about blowing people away. Like the Delta Force, they leave nobody alive, and the purpose of their activities would be normally prohibited by U.S. law. But the men who set it up together, Gary Howard and Ronald Tucker, both said that their work had the approval of Mother, remember that broadcast, which meant State Department, CIA, and Defense Department, and Howard and Tucker were involved in Pentagon intelligence specialties. They worked with the former head of the Defense Intelligence Agent, a retired Army Lieutenant General Samuel Vinson. They worked with Lieutenant Colonel Wayne Long, senior military top of secret military intelligence unit called FOG, Foreign Operations Group. And the point is that these men had very high credentials, and the president of Peregrine Company was a officer, Major General Richard Meadows. In 1981, there was that rescue mission in Iran that failed when Jimmy Carter was so badly smeared, and 3 of the people involved in that rescue mission were working 3 units under Oliver North that stayed together. One was the ISA, Intelligence Support Activity. The other is the SEALs, Team 6, and the other is Task Force 160. And once Ronald Reagan was elected in 1981, and Jimmy Carter as a whole election nomination, not the nomination, but the election victory was sabotaged, certain people went on to get high jobs in the Reagan administration. One was Oliver North in 1981, who went from the War College right to the National Security Council. The other was Richard Secord, who worked with the rescue mission in Iran, who was then hired by William Casey in the National Security Council. The other was Major General Richard Meadows, who helped with the so-called, helped with the sabotage, was in on the 1980 rescue mission. His face was on the cover of Newsweek. He immediately got a company called Peregrine in 1981 when Reagan was in office. John Singh Laub had access to the White House and began his activities of coups that began long before the Iran-Contra scandal broke open. Singh Laub is a retired general who was busy overthrowing countries and putting in the hands of dictators and working through Western goals and World Anti-Communist League. Singh Laub had immediate access to the White House that he didn't have. He resigned when Jimmy Carter was president. William Casey, who helped steal the papers from Ronald Reagan's desk, became CIA director. William Allen, who was in on the debate papers and the sabotaging of the Iranian rescue, or assisted in that, became National Security Advisor, and Edwin Meese, long identified with the stolen Jimmy Carter papers, became Attorney General. So the change of power from Carter to Reagan was evident in the very high positions, the highest positions, of the people who helped him steal the election. And now I want to get back to that Houston Post article of Howard and Tucker, who worked with these teams, and Mr. Meadows in 1981 became the head of Peregrine Associates. But they've been asking the government for some money. Mr. Gary Howard and Ron Tucker have been asking for money, and the Houston Post has a story saying that the 2 Austin men, Gary Howard and Ron Tucker, helped in Texas with the arrest of a gentleman, Mr. Ian Smalley, who was sending arms to Iran. He was an Iran arms dealer, and one of the big problems going on was that only Stiebaum and the Italian connections got the big money for sending the arms to Iran, and the other people were not only either not arrested, they were let off, or their case was trumped up to keep them from making the profits and keeping them out of the Iran arms business. And you read about these arrests in New York, Los Angeles, and so forth. Well, a man named Ian Smalley, and his name was in the paper just a few years ago, and I remember saving the article. He was called Dr. Doom. He's one of the world's foremost arms merchants, and he was sending weapons to Iran, to the Middle East. So Mr. Tucker and Mr. Howard, who were working for the Texas Department of Public Safety as narcotic agents, they were working for the federal agencies, were given the assignment to follow Ian Smalley and stop his arms to Iran, and the 2 men did this. They were doing this until Peregrine was formed in December of 81, and they seized a plane, a Boeing 707, with a large amount of weapons that was bound for South Africa, and that was called Houston 1. And then they also worked on the case of Ian Smalley and tried to interfere with his sending weapons to Iran. When the Iranians caught on to what he was doing and suspected him, they found out that he was working for members of the late Shah's entourage and that they were trying to overthrow the radical government of Iran. And also, Peregrine, one of the purposes of Peregrine, the stated goals of the military, was to kill Khomeni and overthrow Iran. So when they discovered what he was doing, Smalley decided, well, maybe he'd send the arms to Iraq instead. And then he had another plan for sending arms to Iran. He had a ship bound for a port in the United Arab Emirates, and then the plot was to kill the freighter's pilot before its arrival, then divert the arms to Iran by killing the whole crew, send it to Iran, and then part of the arms would go to Iraq, and King Hussein could keep profits from the arms sales. Well, these men worked very hard on this case and put about $1.5 million into chasing where Ian Smalley was sending his weapons and how he was sending them, which indeed he was doing. And he was also working with the government to stop them impounding airplanes that belonged to Gaddafi. They're held in Marietta, Georgia, and he wanted these released to a third party and then sent to Libya. So when these men caught on to what was happening, then the government dropped the suit, and the customs decided to drop the entire investigation, not to file any charges against Smalley, and then they wouldn't give the $1.2 million back to the men who they allowed to form the company Peregrine, but they wouldn't pay him back for following Smalley for a year and getting the information they needed to prosecute him. Now, part of this article in the Houston Post that caught my eye said that in the suit, Mr. Tucker and his co-worker Gary Howard said that the Texans claimed they were led to believe that the then Treasury Secretary Donald Reagan knew about and supported the operation that was going on, that he supported this operation. Now, Donald Reagan's Merrill Lynch, when he was chairman of it before he became Secretary of the Treasury, is linked to that Steve Baum connection to Syria and the deposits that went into the account in New York. And these people are claiming in a suit filed in Washington this past week, we want the money because we did all the work. We put in $1.4 million into this operation. We followed Mr. Smalley, Dr. Doom, the foremost arms merchant. He was sending arms to Iran. And these men work with the Defense Department. The Peregrine Company works directly with the Defense Department and with John Singlau. And their complaint was that the whole thing was dropped after they located how the weapons were going to go, and also plans to get airplanes to Gaddafi that he's been wanting. And the paragraph that was interesting, besides the connection of these people of the Defense Department to Iran, was the fact that in the suit they were led to believe that the Treasury Secretary Donald Reagan knew about and supported the operation. Now, I want to go on to an article which just came out of New Times, August the 17th, 1987, titled The Mystery of Operation DEVAVEND. DEVAVEND is the name of a mountain in Iran, and this is where the connections begin to come together. There's a map in this article of Operation DEVAVEND and Oliver North's group, and when they bring in Oliver North to this operation, then you understand what I was trying to say last week on World Watchers program about the connections of Syria and Henri Arsan to the arms to Iran, something that had been going on for a long time, and that bank account of Credit Suisse of the yellow fruit operation that North and Seacourt operated is something that they inherited. There was a continuous operation, and that the arms to Iran went that way long before we knew about the Iran-Contra affair. I was doing broadcasts 4 years ago, as was David Emery and Nip Tuck up on KFJC, about these particular people that I'm going to get into if I have time this hour. Otherwise, I will continue it next week. It involves Glauco Partel and Henri Arsan and the Nugan Hand Bank, and makes a full cycle of how deep the narcotics traffic is around the world, linked to worldwide Nazis, and also the weapon sales and how they are delivered. And it's part and parcel of a world operation, not simply the Medellin cartel floating a few drugs into Fort Lauderdale or into Miami from Colombia. Now, this article, this is the article, The Mystery of Operation DEVAVEND. The masterminds of the Iran-Contra affair, this author says, Lev Maharovich, I hope I pronounced it right, the masterminds of this affair still remain in the shadows, but they left plenty of traces, particularly in Italy. For instance, this whole article is about the Italian connections of our Defense Department and the drugs. The testimony so far revealed by the Iran-Contra group explained half-truths, numerous omissions, part omissions, and not to speak of all the shredded material that was going on for a long, long time. And maybe with this story you'll understand why Oliver North was shredding papers from October when Eugene Hassenfuss landed, and then when he said to Edwin Meese, how long do I have, 24 hours or 48 hours, this may explain what some of the shredding was. When you refer to arms to Iran, he said, I didn't want people's lives to be lost. I'll take a 1-minute break now before I begin this article and do these connections for the remaining half hour. The title of this broadcast is World Watchers, in case you just picked it up in the middle and don't know what you're hearing. This is Mae Brussell, and this is the second half of the 1-hour program, number 822. We number them each week, I do, so you can keep track of how they flow. And if you're listening to 822 and you've listened to them going way back to 1984, you will be able to understand some of the things I was saying. I'm looking at a sheet from broadcast 679, December 10th, 1984. That was 3 years ago, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But now back to the article, The Mystery of Operation DEVAVEND. The author claims that this investigation has covered up a lot, omitted a lot. But he said in Italy, the assassination attempt on Judge Carlo Palermo was planned in Sicily's Trapani suburb. There was an attempt to murder him. I'm surprised there haven't been more, but he is very much alive and continuing his work. A Volkswagen was packed with 50 kegs of dynamite. It was to explode when Palermo reached a certain corner. A small golf car suddenly inserted itself between the Volkswagen and Judge Palermo's car. The golf car took the main impact of the explosion. A woman and her twins were blown apart. In 1980, starting in 1980, and these were the years when Ronald Reagan was getting ready to be president again, and Jimmy Carter was running against him, Judge Palermo started to investigate what was a petty affair, a secret heroin warehouse in Italy. The warehouse led to the illegal trade of small arms. There were the drugs with a few arms. Later, the arrested said they bought the morphine into Italy from the Middle East, and in return for small arms and rifles, the morphine came in and they sent arms to the Middle East. By November 1982, 2 years later, Judge Palermo began to get into the big shots behind the heroin sales. Now, right after the Pope was shot in May of 1981, the story broke open about the P2, the secret government, the Masonic Lodge, the Nazi, remember the Waffen-SS, Gestapo, Licio Gelli, who fled Italy and was at Ronald Reagan's inauguration in 1981, and into the secret government in the world that involves fascism, Nazism, and our GOP in this country, and overthrowing what are democracies in other countries. But getting now to November 1982, because 81 was a hot time when Licio Gelli fled, and the P2 story was breaking open. And by June 1982, Roberta Calvi was found hanging over a bridge in London, and Edwin Wilson was brought back to the United States, so I'm giving you a time frame. By November 82, Judge Palermo started to get into the big shots behind the heroin weapons sale, and the opening of the P2 helped him with that. He caught up with Henri Arsan, the owner of 2 import-export firms. One's called Stibam, S-T-I-B-A-M, and the other Erexport, with their headquarters in Milan. And, of course, they use the same building that Roberta Calvi used with the Banco Ambrosiano that gets heavily tied into the Vatican funds and Paul Marcinkus and the various scandals since that time. Henri Arsan is from Syria. He was supplying weapons to Iran on behalf of the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency. Henri Arsan. These deliveries began in 1981. Now, many of you might have read Barbara Honegger's article in These Times, how the election was stolen in 1980. The agreement of Ronald Reagan, the administration, to send arms to Iran in return for their holding the hostages so Reagan would get elected. And this confirms a lot of what she wrote and a lot of material that has come out about the operations. And that's why I cited earlier, first part of this program, the people involved with the sabotage of the elections in 1980 and how they moved up into key positions of the administration as soon as Reagan was president in 1981. Arsan was involved in saying the deliveries starting in 1981 to Iran. In 1979, the staff of the U.S. Embassy were taken hostage. The CIA were left with no one in Iran who could supply information. Langley's intelligence was undermined after the overthrow of the Shah. The Pentagon was told they have to release the hostages, but they had no reliable information. The United States Department of Defense set up an additional section for the collection of intelligence called Operation Eagle Claw. Now, this is where Major General Richard Meadows is involved with Peregrine. He's retired in 1982. He suddenly retired in 1982, and the article from the Miami Herald couldn't explain why he retired so fast. But in 1982 was when the arms to Iran and the heroin connections were coming with Arsan that tied into Operation Eagle Claw, which involves Major General Richard Meadows. Meadows was under John Singlaub in Vietnam. That's where their close relationship was developed. And Major General Richard Secord, and of course, and then with Oliver North, who was in on that operation in Iran, and also Albert Hakim was over there. In April of 1980, when the hostages were still being held, Eagle Claw ended in a failure. The helicopter crashed and 8 were killed. The Pentagon then decided to set up a permanent joint group to coordinate paramilitary actions and espionage. Shortly after Reagan was inaugurated in 1981, the Section for Intelligence Operations was set up without the knowledge of Congress, and the sending the arms to Iran could only have one purpose. If the hostages were in danger, there's no one in Congress that would want the hostages held up. But if the operation involved sending arms to Iran from then on to pay them for letting Ronald Reagan become president, then they had to hold away from Congress, and that's just what they did. And these operations were set up under these men that I've mentioned, and Oliver North still runs, or ran until he left the NSC, and he still works for the Defense Department, the ISA, the SEALs, Team 6, and Task Force 160. And this article says the most active members of this section were Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North and Major General Secord. Secord and North drew up plans in early 1981 to sell AWACS to Saudi Arabia. We know that. Hundreds of millions of dollars from the sale of the AWACS to Saudi Arabia could be used for the Contras in Central America, the Dushman in Afghanistan, and other operations they had in Africa, Southeast Asia, Middle East, and Europe that would not be controlled or known by the Congress, because Congress controls the CIA somewhat, or has to inform them, but not the Defense Department and not the National Security Council or the National Security Agency. Now, the mystery of Operation DEVAVEND continues. The Pentagon launched another new section called the Special Operations Division, the SOD. It was dubbed the Crazed in the Basement Department because its headquarters were in the Department of Defense. Its agents carry out secret missions abroad for the CIA and DIA from El Salvador, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, Angola. And the SOD, the Special Operations Division, was the brainchild of William Casey of the CIA, but formally it wasn't part of the Langley establishment, so they could act free of congressional control. One of their operation code names was Yellow Fruit. Now, Yellow Fruit, again, is that using the Credit Suisse and these bank accounts, which it turns out have been there quite a long time. This would finance illegal groups abroad using laundered money earned from the sale of arms and narcotics, and this involved the Middle East narcotics. And as I said before, when Mr. Tucker was talking about Peregrine or his partner, they said that was set up in 1981 to do things that Congress can't do and the United States can't do. And this also was an operation that was part of that, that had laundered money, and they could buy weapons and deliver them to the countries they want, and then allow these people to distribute narcotics, particularly in the United States, literally just drug America. From 1979 to 1981, this is from the time the Shah fell until Reagan was elected, and this article says, when the Shah was kicked out till Reagan's inauguration, there was formed an influential military intelligence junta, a sort of invisible government in the United States that has its own army, its own espionage, its own finances, and conducts its own policy. And we've talked about that. I put this on the air and mentioned the material that came out at the time of the Iran-Contra hearings. But this article takes it one step further because, as again, it goes into the narcotics of the Middle East. And that's how General Secord and Ollie North can buy from Mr. al-Kassar, the largest drug dealer in the Middle East, who was tied in Syria to Henri Arsan, because this network has been flowing for a while and could be conducted from Italy, far from the United States. This article says the Pentagon and the CIA needed a pretext to begin their supply of arms to restore their lost prestige in Iran. This was supplied by the tension that arose between Tehran and Baghdad in 1979. The Iraqis were told, go ahead and make war against Iran. They're weak. Khomeni will be out. And we were goading them on because he was old and wouldn't last long. And the tension that arose between the Iran-Iraq war was the pretext for beginning arms and bringing back narcotics, which actually had been going on for a long time. The very same year in 1980, when Judge Carlo Palermo began his investigation, a former pilot of the French naval air arm named Bernard Veuillot, V-E-U-I-L-L-O-T, chose the risky but profitable trade of arms dealer and opened up the first contacts for Iran. He's a former French naval pilot. The pretext he used was that he was sending insecticides from Belgium to Iran, and this is where the arms came in, and then the narcotics came out. 3 American secret services, the CIA, the DIA, and the National Security Agency, immediately developed contacts with Veuillot. And the NSA is very important when I get to Glodo Partel and his role in this. Through this crack, ships and transport planes from different countries started delivering weapons to Iran, to the country that Ronald Reagan was referring as those terrible terrorists. That's the way he described Khomeni. But the CIA, the DIA, and the NSA were sending arms to Iran. The operation was codenamed DEVAVEND, after the mountain in Iran, and more than $2,000 million worth of equipment was delivered to Iran, to Khomeni, through the operation out of Italy, run by our Defense Department. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North's Iran-Contra deal was only $100 million that he got to distribute for the Contras. This was $2,000 million of equipment went to Iran. Judge Carlo Palermo was convinced that the trade in arms and narcotics directly involves certain staff at the U.S. Embassy in Rome. And our ambassador there, Maxwell Rabb's name comes in quite a few articles defending himself against these charges or allegations. Judge Palermo sent an official in late 1982, after the Arsan scandal broke out, after the Steve Bam story connected not only to the Vatican but to the massive drugs coming into this country. Judge Palermo sent a letter. He asked 2 American diplomats for their presence. He wanted to question them. The letter was ignored. In August of 1982, when Judge Palermo was tracking down Henri Arsan, the United States National Security Council, the NSC, approved of a secret part of what they called Project Democracy. While he was looking for Arsan, Project Democracy was started. Ronald Reagan spoke in June of 82 before the British Parliament, and I'll have to check the date and see if his speech was before or after Roberta Calvi was murdered in London, but he presented a project for Europe and the world called Project Democracy. And this article says the covert part of Operations Democracy started to provide support for the Contras, and it continued the military arms for Iran, including deliveries through the Italian port of Talamone. That we started, we didn't stop the operation, and Ronald Reagan was continuously sending arms to Iran. This wasn't just a gesture because some hostages were taken. Some of the new batch of hostages weren't even taken in this interim, and this must have been a continuous blackmail payoff for the 1980 election victory. From that time, delivery of weapons to Iran proceeded along 2 specific channels. After Reagan was in 1981, Oliver North's group worked through the National Security Council with Secord and Credit Suisse and that yellow fruit operation, and then the Pentagon within the framework of Operation DEVAVEND, which was their operation. By the end of 1982, starting in 83, Iran was desperately in need American military hardware, which made up 95% of their arsenal. Only a few of their fighters were bought before the Shah was overthrown, a few of them, and only were operational, and they need more parts. So part of the National Security Council and Defense Department's Operation DEVAVEND, Bernard Villot and another French weapon dealer, Claude Lang, who worked with the CIA, set up a company called Daloa Finance Company in Panama that would send American arms to Tehran. Now, Henri Arsan was arrested by Judge Palermo. He wanted him. He would have given him a lot of information, but instead Palermo was sent to Turkey, where he died, and he died in the San Vittore prison in Milan, rather. Arsan was back and died in that prison. And then another partner of his, Mr. Celenk, was sent to Turkey, where he died. Roberta Calvi died June 1982. He was hung. And then just about a year ago, Michele Sindona was fed cyanide in a jail, so that Mr. Celenk and Arsan and Calvi and Sindona are four of the kingpins that have died that would give information. It was Arsan who died in the jail in Italy. Now, April 1983, Glauco Partel, and this is an important name because of his links to operations involving Ronald Reagan's administration and so forth. Glauco Partel had been arrested, and that's a gentleman I did broadcasts about going in 1984. And that started a panic in the CIA and the DIA because Judge Palermo applied to the Italian Ministry of the Interior for information, and their computer came up with this information about Glauco Partel. This is a guy, as I said, I was talking about on World Watchers a few years, 3 years ago. He graduated from 3 colleges. He was a former naval officer. He headed a privately owned design office in Rome. And Glauco Partel was important because Judge Palermo was questioning him, and what Judge Palermo was onto was the arms to Iran and the narcotics from the Middle East and the connections to the Ali North Seacourt operations with Mr. al-Kassar in Syria, who obviously, and of course this author links to the Arsan operation. Glauco Partel has a privately owned design office in Rome. It's called Rocket Engines Research Center. He's a member of the Academy of Sciences in New York, London, and Paris. His patents for inventions and rocket engineering work. He works for the American Secret Service. Again, another one. Arsan worked for the American Secret Service, and also Glauco Partel. He's an expert on disinformation, and of course working in and out of Italy with the Super Sesame. The Italian military intelligence has been Michael Ledeen, a genius of disinformation. Partel had access to top-secret NATO information, and of course Alexander Haig was head of NATO for a long time in Europe, and when he left, Lord Carrington of Kissinger Associates became head of NATO, and NATO was heavily involved with the P2 scandal, people from NATO. Partel supplied Judge Palermo with a lot of information how the weapons were sold, about the American Secret Service, and how they were selling arms to Iran. Now, this is in 1983 when Partel is talking to Palermo about the arms to Iran, and he told of the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Operations. All of this outside of Congress, but readily available if any person in Congress wanted to read the same newspapers I read. And a lot of the material of Glauco Partel comes from Jonathan Marshall, who just came out with a new book with Peter Dale Scott on the Iran-Contra affair. The article called Operation DEVAVEND continues. In November 1983, Judge Palermo questioned Captain Angelo De Feo, who had a senior post in the Italian intelligence service for 5 years. De Feo told Palermo about the real significance of Talamay Port, about the illegal arms deliveries that were strictly controlled by the secret services. There was a sharp increase of arms through Talamay in 1980 due to Operation DEVAVEND coming out of the Pentagon, and later due to Oliver North's NSC group. By October 1986, and October 86 is when Hassenfuss landed in the grass in Nicaragua, at least 60 vessels had been packed with arms and ammunition headed for Iran that had left the port in Italy, the important port of Talamany. And remember, as soon as Iran-Contra came down, there was talk of Italian ships and weapons to Iran, and that was hushed up immediately across every major station. This article said the arms, trade in arms, the profits from it was one of the channels through which the Americans, the Italian, and other arms dealers helped finance the ruling party in Italy. They put pressure on the socialists, the Christian Democrats, and just as the Nugan Hand Bank was used by this same team in Australia to affect the government, and then Nugan Hand's investigation was protected by the next government that came into power, they were also using this in Italy and many other countries around the world. In 1983, Judge Palermo's attention was diverted from the Italian investigation because the government was coming down on him. He was making the authorities angry. He was saying that Americans that were deploying their nuclear cruise missiles in Italy at this time, and Italy wanted the profit and wanted the cruise missiles, and they didn't want Judge Palermo investigating any of these scandals about arms to Iran. So by 1984, he was forced to close his case, the legal case, on the underground dealers, but he kept up his own private investigation. And during that period, Oliver North was extending his network into different countries and private organizations that would finance anti-communist organizations throughout the world when Congress refused to have the funds. Operation DEVAVEND was doing very well. The deals were actively supported by the National Security Council. Then a man named Michael Austin, the owner of New York firm of Austin Aerospace and Universal Aerospace, joined in the weapons sales and started sending weapons to Iran. In June 1984, the narcotics case was taken out of Judge Palermo's hands and moved from Trento to Rome, where it continued. Palermo's files were confiscated. He requested a parliamentary commission to watch over the ministers in the government and investigate members of the Craxi government. And it was Mr. Craxi, the Prime Minister of Italy, who Michael Ledeen called the night that the terrorists were being flown in Italy after the Achille Lauro affair. Michael Ledeen of Super Sesame was close to Craxi. Craxi is now out of the influential position he had, although I'm sure he still has some power in the Italian government. This article says the investigation that Palermo had would have been a greater threat to Operation DEVAVEND with arms to Iran from the Pentagon. And meanwhile, Oliver North and the Pentagon in 1984 were sending weapons, and Richard Secord was brought in to be the leader to distribute some of the money to the Contras. By October 1984, Judge Carlo Palermo was moved to Trapani, which was a better move because he could establish from there the transfer points of the illegal trade of arms and narcotics, and he was big into the Henri Arsan and the Syrian narcotics. This is where the American bases in Italy were, among them the naval base at Maddalena near Sardinia, and here the ships were loaded for military supplies for Iran, and the Sicilian Mafia, especially the Greco and Liggio families, which had long-standing ties with the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency, were part of helping send arms into Iran, and in return they were getting the drugs out of Iran that continued. The Shah's family was heavy into the flow of narcotics through their family and the profits they could accrue from it. But this operation continued when the Shah was out because Khomeni was angry that Jimmy Carter had the Shah in this country, and therefore he was willing to oblige Ronald Reagan, and in return for arms, the drugs were coming from our Defense Department and CIA through Italy. The article says in January 1985 was the first assassination attempt for Carlo Palermo, but he survived it the day it took place. As I explained before, he was able, unfortunately, these other three people were killed, but he survived it, and it also coincided, the assassination attempt, with major deliveries under the Defense Department Operation DEVAVEND. Michael Austin had arranged the sale of weapons to Iran, and he was later arrested in New York, and he sent them through Egypt and Cairo, and in Egypt they were told the planes were going to go to Turkey. Now, just to continue Operation DEVAVEND as fast as I can and get on to the Italian connections, in December 1985, the Court of Appeal ordered Palermo to hand over everything he had on the underground arms deals and give it to the Venetian judges who were going to shelve it. By December the 4th, Robert McFarlane left the National Security Council. Admiral Poindexter took over, and that very same day, December the 4th, Oliver North suggested going with McFarlane to Iran and now dropping the Israeli middlemen because they could deal directly with Tehran. January 17, 1986, Reagan signed the directive of direct delivery of arms to Iran without the knowledge of Congress, and then Operation DEVAVEND could go from the Pentagon and it would then be in jeopardy because the president had said it was okay. So the secret operations were in jeopardy because they had been going on for a long time through Credit Suisse, through the drug traffic and so forth. And the American customs caught arms dealers red-handed. And, of course, as I say, the case in Texas was dropped of Ian Smalley sending arms, and the case of Paul Cutter evidently has been robbed. Other names, Sishola, his other name, or his original name, and the arms deals to Iran by other people were intercepted by Edwin Meese or prosecuted to stop them from sending, but there got to be a mess because a lot of people were sending arms to Iran with a wink and a nod from the government, and all of a sudden they were arrested. Michael Austin had a hasty trial in New York City. His sentence for arms to Iran was 20 weekends in prison plus a warning, don't talk. And Austin's participants were arrested in Italy and were told to conceal the Pentagon NSC operations. And one of the men who was knowledgeable about the weapons to Iran was Cyrus Hashemi, who was mysteriously killed in London, July 28, 1986. In February of 86, the United States Secret Service turned to the Italian Super Sesame, the Italian intelligence, for help in February 86 because the U.S. wanted to win favor with Iran and speed up delivery of the hostages, so they began escalating their supplying to Iran with intelligence information. They were getting a lot of information from Ali North, who took top-secret material, and of course this probably was a blackmail for not saying how long the weapons were going over there. And May 28, 1986, the Pentagon Room 2B869 decided Operation DEVAVEND could continue, even though the president had now signed a directive for weapons to Iran. In August 1986, the Mafia, the Liscio family, began another plan to get Carlo Palermo, but he was arrested on charges of exceeding his authority, and he wanted to bring out the story of the arms trade and the drugs, and then his trial was postponed indefinitely because he said, if you say I exceed my authority, I want to tell you what I'm doing. And this article concludes, when the Iran-Contra scandal burst open, the flames of the fire jumped to Italy. The unpleasant facts about the government started to come out in Italy. Members of the cabinet openly lied when they denied that arms were shipped to Iran. Members of the cabinet here, at least in June 1984, during the embargo, at least 8 permits for export of arms to Iran took place. Operation DEVAVEND took place from the American bases in Italy, in the port of Talamoni, and also through the offices of Palazzo Margherita, Margherita, where the American embassy had their headquarters. In March 1987, American ambassador to Italy Maxwell Rabb had to appear before a Manhattan court that was examining independent of our Congress that won't touch the Italian ambassador, the smuggling of arms from the United States to Iran. Now, engineer Glauco Partel, Glauco, Partel, testified about his work with the American Secret Service, and he arranged a explosive story, November 30th, 1986, published in L'Espresso in a Rome magazine, where Partel confirmed much of what Judge Palermo had discovered through these years, and regarding the violation of the arms embargo to Iran, the designation of Talamé as the port, the delivery of arms, and other CIA and CIA operations that were going on. And Partel spoke twice of the Italian public figures who were in the pay of the CIA in America, the ministers, the senior military officers who benefited financially from the arms trade. Now, I just have a few minutes to run down some of the articles that maybe I can continue with next week. On broadcast number 679, December the 10th, 1984, I was talking about Rossano Brazzi, a close friend of Ronald Reagan's, and a group of his cohorts that were suspected of selling atomic bombs, submachines, guns, tanks, helicopters, missiles, plutonium, uranium to Iraq, Taiwan, Philippines, and Argentina. And also linked with Rossano Brazzi is Henri Arsan, whose name comes up in other articles that I have, and also there Le Matin, June 20th, 1984, has an article about Claude Partel, who worked 15 years for the National Security Agency, employed 200,000. He was an intermediary for a bomb affair, and he worked with Eugene Bartholomeus from Sydney, Australia. Bartholomeus was receiving weapons from Partel and was involved with the CIA surplus arms storage. And, of course, The Nugan Hand Bank ties to Bartholomeus, goes back to Glauco Partel, and the linkage of the drugs and the weapons of the Secord, Theodore Shackley, Thomas Kleins makes a full cycle from Australia to the Middle East, where they were active in Iran earlier, and to the Iran-Contra team, the Middle East drugs, and the arms to Iran being hidden by the major news media and now finally coming together in a pattern. I don't have time now to rush. I don't want to rush through the connections of these people to Ollie North, Secord, and Henri Arsan and Stiebaum. So I'll do some more of it next week. But finally, the Middle East picture is coming out, and as I mentioned last week, that is a key. What I had on broadcast number 821 is North and Secord buying arms for the Contras from the largest drug dealer in the Middle East, from Syria, the group that were Mr. al-Kassar, who is linked to the late Henri Arsan and their narcotics traffic in Italy. And out of Italy is where the arms were going continuously to Iran ever since the time that the Shah was out of office. So I will try to get back to some of this next week. I hope it isn't too confusing. It is sometimes, but years later you'll understand what I'm saying. This is Mae Brussell, and I'll go along the drug lines of the Middle East because the Central American drug connections are becoming more open every day, and it's building its own momentum, that part of the story.